There is a simple rule in warfare: you do not use a scalpel to demolish a fortress. Merrill's Marauders were a scalpel, an elite special forces unit forged for one purpose. But after their mission was complete, they were ordered to smash themselves against a fortified city, a clear violation of military logic. This isn't just a battle story, it's an investigation into a strategic crime. We're going to find the single, overlooked clue that explains why heroes were ordered to die for nothing. Come closer. Listen, I want to tell you a story about a map. Not just any map, but the one that lived in the mind of Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell in the spring of 1944. On this map, deep in the Emerald Labyrinth of northern Burma, there was a single, vital artery called the Lido Road. It was a lifeline, a desperate, muddy promise being carved through the jungle to keep China in the war. And blocking that promise, like a clot in the heart of the entire Allied effort in Asia, was a Japanese-held town called Myitkyina. For Stilwell, Myitkyina wasn't a place of mud and men. It was a symbol, a chess piece, an objective. The plan on his map was clean, logical, and brutal. He had a special tool for this job, an instrument forged for one purpose. A unit of 3,000 American volunteers, men who had answered a call for a mission that was only ever described as dangerous and hazardous. They were known as the 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional, but history would remember them by their commander's name, Merrill's Marauders. They were a ghost unit, a scalpel designed to slip behind enemy lines, cut crucial nerves, and then vanish back into the jungle. Their mission, the one they signed up for, was to pave the way for a larger Chinese force by creating chaos. A 3-month tour, maximum. That was the promise. Now, I want you to leave that clean, clear map behind. Leave the general's tent, with its crisp lines and confident pins. I want you to come with me into the reality. It's late May, 1944. The monsoon has broken. The world has dissolved into a single, gray, weeping sky and an ocean of brown, grasping mud. We're on the edge of Myitkyina. We've found a man, or what's left of one. He's sitting with his back against the slick, rotting trunk of a banyan tree, trying to find shelter under a poncho that is as thin and torn as a prayer. His name doesn't matter. He is all of them. His uniform, once olive drab, is now a patchwork of mud, sweat, and faded blood. His skin is stretched tight and yellow over his cheekbones, a symptom of the malaria that now owns his blood. His eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, are vacant. They're not looking at the jungle. They're not looking for the enemy. They're 1,000 yards away, staring at ghosts. Every few seconds, his body is racked by a tremor from dysentery, the Burma gallop they call it, a disease that has hollowed him out from the inside, leaving him weighing less than 100 pounds. He's been marching and fighting for 4 months. He has walked over 700 miles through some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet. He and the handful of other specters scattered around him accomplished the impossible just a week ago. They marched 100 miles in 10 days through dense jungle, flanked the entire Japanese defense, and seized Myitkyina's airfield, the main objective. The mission was over. The promise was met. They were supposed to be flown out. Rest. A hospital. Home. That was the logic of the plan. But then, a new order came down the line. It was passed from one skeletal officer to another, a whisper of disbelief carried on the humid air. The words themselves were the anomaly. They were a violation of the laws of military physics. The order was to leave the captured airfield and attack the town of Myitkyina itself. A frontal assault. Not a raid. Not a disruption. A bloody, head-on infantry grind against a heavily fortified, fanatical Japanese garrison. The man under the banyan tree hears the order. He doesn't shout. He doesn't curse. He doesn't even cry. The capacity for those emotions was carved out of him weeks ago by exhaustion and disease. He just slowly, deliberately, tries to get his feet under him. His rifle, a tool he once knew intimately, feels like an anvil in his hands. The scalpel was being ordered to smash a fortress wall. The ghosts were being told to stop haunting the jungle and become corpses in the mud. This is where the official reports go silent. This is where the story you think you know breaks down. Because the greatest mystery of the Marauders isn't how they survived their journey behind enemy lines. It's why, after they had already won, they were ordered to die. How did a surgical special forces unit end up being used as disposable cannon fodder in a battle they were never meant to fight? Back in the rear, far from the rain and the rot, the world made perfect sense. In the dry, clean bubble of Southeast Asia Command, the new order wasn't an anomaly, it was the next logical step on a beautifully drawn map. The official explanation was a masterpiece of military calculus. Think of it like this: seizing the airfield was like kicking in the front door of a house. It was a brilliant, shocking success. But the enemy was still inside, armed and dangerous. Leaving them there, in the town of Myitkyina itself, would be strategic insanity. They could regroup, counterattack, and take the airfield back. The entire 700-mile march, the starvation, the disease, the sacrifice, all of it would be for nothing. The intelligence reports landing on General Stilwell's desk painted a clear and comforting picture. The Japanese garrison in Myitkyina, according to the best estimates from his G2 intelligence section, consisted of maybe 700 men. And not just any men, these were the battered, demoralized remnants of the units the Marauders had already chewed up on their long march through the Yukon Valley. They were tired. They were low on supplies. They were cut off. The capture of the airfield had been the final, decisive blow. All that was left was to push them over. So, from Stilwell's perspective, perched high above the battlefield, the decision was obvious. The Marauders were already there. They were battle-hardened. They had momentum. Why wait for the large, slow-moving Chinese divisions to arrive and get organized? A swift, sharp blow now could take the town in 48 hours. It would be a final, glorious chapter to the Marauders' already legendary campaign. The plan wasn't a betrayal, it was an honor. It was a vote of supreme confidence. The scalpel wasn't being asked to smash a fortress wall, it was being tasked with a final, precise incision to remove the last bit of cancerous tissue. The official story was that this was a simple, necessary, and imminently achievable mop-up operation. But on the ground, a different story was being written in the mud. The contradiction to this clean, official narrative wasn't a complex analysis, it was the sound of shovels. All through the night, the exhausted Marauders lying in their water-filled foxholes around the airfield could hear it, the rhythmic, chilling scrape and thud of the Japanese digging. And digging. And digging. It wasn't the sound of a demoralized, remnant force. It was the sound of a disciplined, determined army preparing for a siege. It was the sound of fresh reinforcements arriving from the north, men who hadn't spent months being bled white in the jungle. Colonel Charles Hunter, who had taken command after General Merrill suffered his second heart attack, saw the truth with his own eyes. His patrols weren't finding stragglers, they were bumping into expertly laid tripwires and newly established machine gun nests. They brought back captured Japanese soldiers who, under interrogation, spoke not of 700 men, but of several thousand. The number 4,000 foot started appearing in the reports sent back to headquarters. 4,000 fresh, well-dug-in Imperial Japanese soldiers. Hunter sent frantic messages back to Stilwell's command post. This wasn't a mop-up. This was a fortress. His men were not battle-hardened, they were ghosts. He reported the staggering rates of sickness, malaria, typhus, amoebic dysentery. He described men literally too weak to lift their own weapons. He wasn't requesting, he was pleading. His unit, the 5,307th, had ceased to be a functioning combat force. Sending them against the town wasn't a risk, it was a guaranteed annihilation. The reports went up the chain of command. A desperate flare of ground truth shot into the comfortable darkness of the official story. And then, the reply came back. It wasn't a set of questions. It wasn't a request for clarification. It was a single, cold, clear confirmation of the original order, tinged with an unmistakable air of annoyance. Stilwell's staff, and perhaps the general himself, had made a choice. They chose to believe their map over the reality their men were dying in. The contradiction was no longer a matter of conflicting intelligence. It was now a direct order to ignore the evidence of their own senses. The official explanation was a fantasy, and the men on the ground were now being ordered to die for it. To understand what happens next, you have to understand the pressure cooker that Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell was living in. This wasn't just about one town in Burma. This was about the fate of Asia. Imagine the entire Allied war effort as a complex, groaning machine. The main gears are turning in Europe. D-Day is just weeks away, and in the Central Pacific, where Nimitz is clawing his way across the ocean. The China-Burma-India Theater, the CBI, was considered by many in London and Washington to be a strategic backwater, a sideshow. Stilwell was constantly fighting a war on two fronts, one against the Japanese and another against his own Allied high command for every rifle, every transport plane, every bullet. Now, let's use a war college analogy. Think of China as a massive steam engine, capable of tying down over 1 million Japanese soldiers. But by 1944, that engine was running on fumes. The Japanese had cut its last land-based fuel line, the Burma Road, back in 1942. The only thing keeping it from seizing up completely was a tiny, leaky, and terrifyingly dangerous garden hose of a supply line, the air route over the Himalayan mountains, a route the pilots grimly called the hump. It was never enough. Stilwell's grand project, the one thing that consumed his every waking thought, was the construction of a new, gleaming steel pipeline, the Lido Road. A road he was hacking through hundreds of miles of the world's worst jungle, a lifeline that would connect India to China and bring that great engine roaring back to life. And the town of Myitkyina, with its all-weather airfield, wasn't just another objective on that road. It was the master valve on the entire pipeline. Without that airfield, heavy engineering equipment couldn't be flown in. Without that equipment, the road couldn't push through the mountains before the full force of the monsoon turned the world into an impassable swamp. The window to open the valve was closing, and closing fast. Stilwell was a man possessed by this brutal, unforgiving arithmetic. In his mind, the clock wasn't just ticking for the men outside Myitkyina, it was ticking for the entire war in China. From that terrible height, the equation was simple, cold, and horrific. The potential loss of one regiment, even a legendary one, weighed against the potential collapse of an entire front. The pleas from Colonel Hunter, the reports of sickness and exhaustion, the warnings of 4,000 entrenched Japanese soldiers, they were all just noise against the deafening tick of that strategic clock. The ground truth was an inconvenience. The reality of his men's suffering was a variable that his formula simply could not afford to accept. He had his tool in place. It was damaged, yes. It was screaming in protest, yes. But it was there, and he was going to use it. The debate, if there ever truly was one, was over. The order was not to be questioned further. The attack on Myitkyina would proceed. It was no longer a mission to be accomplished. A sentence had been passed by the cold logic of grand strategy, and the exhausted, ghost-like men of the 5,307th were about to be marched to their own execution. The investigation began not in a quiet room with a map, but in the crucible of the first assault. It was a clumsy, desperate, and bloody affair. The 48-hour mop-up met its first contradiction in the first 48 seconds, in the form of a scything, interlocking field of machine gun fire that ripped through the thin ranks of the Marauders. The sound wasn't the sporadic chatter of a demoralized remnant, it was the steady, confident rhythm of a well-supplied, expertly sighted defense. The plan, so logical in the rear, dissolved into a series of desperate, isolated firefights in the mud and razor grass on the outskirts of Myitkyina. After 2 days of this brutal calculus, with casualties mounting at an alarming rate, a new, more focused objective was designated. It was a position the maps called the North Moat, a waterlogged ditch that curled around the northern edge of the town. On paper, it looked like a simple, secondary defensive line. The G2 intelligence summary described it as lightly held. For the men tasked with taking it, it was a chance to find the first real clue to the mystery of the enemy's strength. It was a chance to capture prisoners, to seize documents, to find a piece of hard evidence that could cut through the fog of Stilwell's assumptions. The men of the 2nd Battalion were given the job. They were a collection of walking skeletons, their bodies racked with fever, but their eyes held a cold, analytical fury. They moved out under the perpetual gray drizzle, not with hope, but with a grim sense of purpose. The attack on the North Moat was a microcosm of the entire siege. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through knee-deep water, the air thick with the buzz of mosquitoes and the whine of ricochets. They were met with a storm of mortar fire, perfectly registered, terrifyingly accurate. This wasn't a panicked defense. This was a symphony of violence, conducted by an unseen hand. But after hours of fighting, paying for every single yard in blood, they finally breached the enemy line. They swarmed into the Japanese bunkers, a tide of gaunt, exhausted men running on pure adrenaline. And it was here, in the captured positions, that they found it. The first clue. It wasn't a single piece of paper. It was everything. The bunkers weren't shallow foxholes, they were elaborate, timber-reinforced pillboxes, connected by deep communication trenches. They found caches of ammunition and food that could sustain a fight for weeks, not days. The bodies of the Japanese defenders weren't the gaunt, ragged soldiers they had been chasing through the jungle. These men were fresh. Their uniforms were newer, their equipment was in good repair, and they had the well-fed look of a garrison force, not a depleted patrol. Then, one of the Marauders found the prize. In the corner of a collapsed command bunker, next to the body of a Japanese officer, was a leather satchel. Inside was a logbook. It was soaked in rainwater and blood, but the neat columns of Japanese script were still legible. Even without a translator, the meaning was terrifyingly clear. The book detailed troop arrivals and ration strengths. The dates were recent. The numbers were large. This wasn't a logbook for a company. It was for a full-strength, heavily reinforced regiment that G2 intelligence insisted did not exist. For the survivors of the assault, huddled in the captured trench, this was a moment of grim, exhilarating vindication. The exhaustion, the fear, the gnawing disease, all of it was momentarily forgotten. They had proof. Tangible, undeniable proof that Colonel Hunter was right. The official story wasn't just wrong, it was a lethal fiction. They weren't failing because they were weak. They were failing because they had been sent on a fool's errand, an impossible task based on a catastrophic intelligence failure. The captured logbook, wrapped carefully in a waterproof pouch, was immediately sent back to battalion headquarters. It was a single, undeniable piece of truth, paid for in blood and sent back up the line like an explosive charge designed to shatter the fantasy world of the rear echelon. It was proof. It had to be enough. The logbook arrived at Stilwell's forward headquarters like a heresy. It was a physical object, a piece of ground truth that flatly contradicted the pristine architecture of the official plan. For a moment, it seemed like the key that would unlock the entire mystery, the evidence that would force a reevaluation. But the investigators on the ground had fatally underestimated their true adversary. It wasn't just the Japanese. It was the crushing inertia of a plan that had become an article of faith. They had assumed the enemy was a simple brute force. They were about to discover he was a master of psychological warfare, and that his greatest ally was the stubborn pride of Allied High Command. Stilwell's G2 intelligence section, the very office responsible for the initial, fatally flawed estimates, received the captured logbook. And here, the battle shifted from the muddy trenches of Myitkyina to the sterile corridors of command. The book was a threat. It wasn't just evidence of Japanese reinforcements, it was an indictment of their own professional competence. And so, the system, instinctively, began to defend itself. Imagine you're a staff officer in that tent. Your entire career is built on providing the general with clear, actionable intelligence. You told him there were 700 demoralized troops. Now, a bloody, mud-stained book from the front lines is telling you there are thousands. Do you admit a catastrophic failure? Or do you find a way to make the book fit your existing narrative? The official analysis that came back down the line was a masterpiece of bureaucratic self-preservation. The logbook, they argued, was a deliberate plant, a piece of misinformation. Think of the enemy's genius. Why would a Japanese officer be so careless as to leave a complete order of battle in a forward bunker? It was a classic deception, a trick designed to sow panic and doubt, to make the Marauders believe they were facing an overwhelming force to break their will to fight. It was, the G2 summary concluded, evidence not of Japanese strength, but of their desperation. They were trying to win the battle with ink, because they knew they couldn't win it with bullets. The promising lead, the one tangible piece of evidence paid for in Marauder blood, had been turned on its head. It was no longer proof of the ground truth. It was now twisted into further proof of the official story. The system wasn't just ignoring the evidence, it was actively metabolizing it, turning poison into nourishment for its own delusions. Colonel Hunter and his officers were stunned. They were trapped in a Kafkaesque nightmare. They were sending back bodies and getting back theories. They were reporting the reality of interlocking machine gun fire and being told they were falling for a psychological trick. The failure of the logbook to change the official narrative was a devastating blow. It plunged the men back into a deeper state of despair. They were not just being ignored, they were being actively disbelieved. They weren't just fighting the Japanese in front of them. They were fighting the ghosts of their own command behind them. And in that moment of profound isolation, they realized a terrible truth: they were not the hunters in this investigation. They weren't even the victims. They were the evidence. Their bodies, broken by disease and Japanese bullets, were the clues that command was refusing to read. And the enemy, knowing this, simply had to wait for the self-inflicted wounds of Allied command to do his work for him. Just as the Marauders reached the absolute nadir of their despair, trapped between an implacable enemy and an immovable command, the battlefield itself offered up a new line of inquiry. The breakthrough didn't come from a captured document or a high-level directive. It came from the sky. It came in the form of a handful of men who saw the world not as a muddy trench line, but as a vast, interconnected grid. They were the eyes of the army, the forward artillery observers, and the liaison pilots of the tiny L for Grasshopper planes. These pilots were a special breed of crazy. They flew frail, unarmed aircraft that were little more than fabric wings stretched over a steel tube frame, powered by an engine with less horsepower than a modern lawnmower. Their job was to circle low and slow over the battlefield, acting as the airborne eyes for the artillery batteries hidden miles away. From their precarious perch, they could see the whole chessboard. They weren't confined to the worm's eye view of the infantrymen. They saw the flashes of enemy mortars, the subtle dust signatures of truck convoys, the faint, new trails being cut through the jungle at night. For weeks, these pilots had been reporting anomalies. They saw movement where the official maps showed nothing but dense, impassable jungle. They reported regular, almost scheduled, vehicle traffic on trails that, according to G2, didn't exist. But their reports, like the pleas from the infantry, were dismissed as insignificant local patrols, minor resupply efforts. They were just more noise, more inconvenient data points that didn't fit the clean narrative of a cut-off, beleaguered garrison. The breakthrough came from a young lieutenant, a forward observer who was tired of being ignored. His name is lost to the official histories, but his actions changed the course of the siege. He had a simple, brilliant idea. Instead of just reporting individual sightings, he started to plot them on his own map. Every truck, every mortar flash, every new trail. For days, he painstakingly collected the disparate, seemingly random reports from the other pilots and observers, collating them, connecting the dots. Slowly, a ghostly image began to emerge on his map, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. The random sightings weren't random at all. They formed a clear, undeniable line. It was a hidden supply route, a secret artery snaking its way down from the north, carefully camouflaged from the air, bypassing the main roads that Allied bombers were pounding. It terminated not just in Myitkyina, but in the very sector of the town's defense that was proving the most stubborn, the most well-supplied, the most lethal. This wasn't a logbook that could be dismissed as a plant. This was a pattern of life. It was 100 different data points, collected by a dozen different observers over 2 weeks, all pointing to the same shocking conclusion: the Japanese garrison wasn't cut off. It wasn't withering on the vine. It was being actively and systematically reinforced and resupplied right under their noses. The lieutenant took his map, with its web of terrifying new connections, directly to Colonel Hunter. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of something other than despair appeared in the command bunker. This was it. This was the irrefutable, systematic proof they needed. This evidence couldn't be twisted. It didn't rely on the interpretation of a single captured document. It was a detailed portrait of the enemy's entire logistical operation. It revealed not just their strength, but their method. A new, more dangerous path forward was suddenly clear. They had to stop attacking the fortress wall. They had to find a way to sever this hidden artery. Armed with the pilot's map, Colonel Hunter now possessed something far more potent than a plea for relief. He had a diagnosis. The map didn't just show that his men were dying, it showed precisely why they were dying. Every assault they had launched was the equivalent of trying to bail out a flooding room with a teacup while a fire hose was blasting through a hidden hole in the wall. The problem wasn't the strength of the Japanese in Myitkyina, it was the uninterrupted flow of men and munitions coming down that secret northern road. This new evidence forced a radical shift in strategy. Instead of continuing the futile, head-on assaults, Hunter proposed a daring new plan, born of desperation and newfound clarity. He would use the last functioning remnants of his unit not as a battering ram, but as the scalpel they were always meant to be. He would dispatch a small, mobile force, a new group of marauders, essentially to perform a deep flanking maneuver, cut this hidden supply line, and starve the garrison into submission. It was a classic special forces solution to an infantry problem. But in presenting this plan, Hunter and his staff were inadvertently stumbling into the most dangerous territory of all. They were no longer just contradicting an intelligence assessment, they were now challenging the fundamental strategic vision of their commanding general. And in doing so, they were about to uncover the most uncomfortable truth of the entire campaign. The report, with its meticulously plotted map and its new, logical plan of action, was sent back to Stilwell's headquarters. The response they expected was relief, perhaps even commendation, for finally solving the puzzle. The response they got was a cold, stunning silence, followed by a direct, furious order to cease all such unauthorized reconnaissance and continue the frontal assaults as planned. The reason for this shocking rebuke was buried in the political DNA of the entire CBI theater. General Stilwell's relationship with the commander of the Chinese forces, Chiang Kai-shek, was famously toxic. Stilwell, known as Vinegar Joe, believed the Chinese commanders were corrupt and incompetent, while Chiang viewed Stilwell as an arrogant imperialist. Stilwell's entire justification for being in command, the very foundation of his authority, rested on one premise: that he could achieve results the Chinese could not. He had promised Washington and London that his American-led strategy would succeed where others had failed. The existence of a fully operational, hidden Japanese supply route from the north was not just a military problem, it was a devastating political catastrophe for Stilwell. Why? Because the entire northern approach to Myitkyina was supposed to be the responsibility of the main body of the Chinese army. For weeks, Stilwell had been prodding and insulting the Chinese commanders, accusing them of cowardice and lethargy for their slow advance. Now, this new map from his own men proved that a major Japanese reinforcement route was operating, completely unmolested, right in the middle of the Chinese sector. To accept the Marauders' map as truth would be to admit a series of fatal flaws in his own command. It would mean admitting that his intelligence was wrong. It would mean admitting that his strategy of frontal assault was failing. But worst of all, it would mean admitting that the Chinese commanders he so openly despised might have had a valid reason for their caution. It would vindicate their slowness and make him look like a fool. The uncomfortable truth wasn't that the Japanese were stronger than they thought. The truth was that Stilwell's grand plan had a gaping, fatal hole in it, a hole created by the very allies he was meant to be leading. And his pride, his entire political position, could not allow him to acknowledge it. The system didn't just push back, it came down like an avalanche. The revelation of the northern supply route, which should have been a moment of strategic clarity, was treated as an act of insubordination. Stilwell's headquarters saw Hunter's report not as a solution, but as an accusation. It was a piece of paper that implicitly blamed the general's core strategy and his handling of the Chinese alliance for the bloody stalemate at Myitkyina. And Vinegar Joe Stilwell was not a man who tolerated blame. The first blow was a direct, brutally worded cable to Colonel Hunter. The order was unequivocal: the 5,307th would continue its attacks on the southern and eastern perimeter of the town. There would be no sideshow operations to the north. The Chinese sector was a Chinese problem. The Marauders' job was to fight where they were told. The message was clear: your job is not to understand the map, your job is to bleed on the part of it we assign to you. The pilot's map, the product of so much ingenuity and risk, was effectively thrown in the trash. But it didn't stop there. A narrative began to circulate from the rear echelon, a quiet, corrosive whisper campaign designed to discredit the source of the inconvenient truth. The Marauders, the story went, were losing their nerve. After their heroic march, they were simply exhausted. Their reports of overwhelming enemy strength and secret supply lines weren't sound intelligence, they were the excuses of men who had reached the end of their psychological tether. The term combat fatigue was used, not as a diagnosis, but as a dismissal. They weren't whistleblowers, they were complainers. The system was now actively at war with its own nerve endings. Imagine a man whose hand is on a hot stove. His nerves are screaming, telling him to pull away. But his brain, committed to the idea that the stove is cold, sends back a simple message: the nerves are lying. Keep the hand there. This was the state of the American command in Burma. The most damning move came next. Stilwell dispatched one of his most trusted staff officers, Brigadier General John E. Wiley, to the front. Officially, his mission was to assess the situation. In reality, it was to enforce the official narrative. Wiley arrived not as an investigator, but as a prosecutor. He didn't interview the sick and wounded in the makeshift aid stations. He didn't fly with the L-4 pilots to see the hidden trails for himself. He held a series of tense, formal meetings with Colonel Hunter and his staff, during which he made it plain that their pessimism was bordering on defeatism and was having a negative effect on morale. He reviewed the casualty figures not with alarm, but with a cold, appraising eye, as if they were production quotas that weren't being met. The message was delivered with the crushing weight of institutional authority. Your reports have been heard, considered, and rejected. Your alternative theories are not welcome. Your only path forward is to obey the existing orders, regardless of the cost. The investigation was officially over. The truth was buried. The system had protected itself, insulating the general from the consequences of his own strategic blindness. The court had ruled, and the men of the 5,307th were guilty of being right at the wrong time. This was the bottom. The absolute, soul-crushing nadir of the entire campaign. The Marauders were no longer just soldiers fighting an enemy. They were prisoners, trapped in a paradox forged by their own command. They were being punished not for failure, but for the unforgivable crime of being correct. The official rejection of their intelligence, the accusations of cowardice, the arrival of General Wiley, it was a systematic dismantling of their last reserves of hope and will. Colonel Hunter, the man who had tried to shield his men, was broken. The strain of the campaign and the impossible moral weight of the situation finally took their toll. He was unceremoniously relieved of command, diagnosed with psychoneurosis, and evacuated to the rear. It was the system's final, brutal act of silencing the messenger. The man who had screamed the truth was officially declared insane. His removal sent a chilling message through the skeletal ranks of the 5,307th. If their commander, a respected West Point colonel, could be disposed of so easily for speaking the truth, what hope was there for any of them? They were truly ghosts now, not just to the enemy, but to their own army. Their reality had been completely and utterly invalidated. What followed was the price of that truth, paid in daily, agonizing installments. With Hunter gone and the official narrative firmly re-established, the orders for frontal assaults resumed with a new, grim determination. The mop-up operation, which had already dragged on for weeks, now entered its most horrific phase. Day after day, the few remaining able-bodied Marauders, a term that had become a cruel joke, as they were now too weak to do anything but shuffle, were sent forward into the same meat grinder. Imagine the scene. A platoon, which should have 40 men, now consists of maybe 10 or 12. Half of them are so racked with fever they have to be helped to the line of departure. They attack the same Japanese machine gun nest they attacked 3 days before. They gain 20 yards of mud. They lose 2 more men. The survivors crawl back, carrying their wounded, to their waterlogged foxholes, where they shiver through another night of rain and shelling, waiting to do the exact same thing again the next day. This wasn't combat anymore. It was a ritual of human sacrifice, offered up to the altar of a flawed plan. The numbers tell a story that transcends words. Of the nearly 3,000 original Marauders who had entered Burma, only 1,400 were still with the unit when they seized the airfield. After 2 months of the siege of Myitkyina, a battle they were never supposed to fight, only 200 of them were left. And of those 200, not a single man was found to be free of malaria, dysentery, or some other debilitating tropical disease. The 5,307th Composite Unit Provisional had, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. It had been systematically and deliberately expended, not in a brilliant flanking maneuver, but in a bloody, pointless, head-on grind. The great historical disaster they had tried to prevent, the destruction of their own unit for no strategic gain, was now complete. The catastrophe was not an ambush or a surprise attack. It was a slow, deliberate process, an order signed and re-signed every day by men who chose to believe their own maps over the lives of their soldiers. The truth had been found, it had been presented, and it had been rejected. And the price was a legacy of ghosts in the Burmese jungle. The final, Bitter irony is that the Marauders didn't even take Myitkyina. They died for it, but they didn't take it. The catastrophe unfolded with the grim predictability they had warned of. For the entire month of June and into July, the ritual of sacrifice continued. The remnants of the Marauders, now amalgamated with fresh infantry replacements who were thrown into the fight with little understanding of the tactical situation, bled themselves white against the town's northern and eastern defenses. The Japanese, sustained by their hidden supply line, replaced their own casualties and rearmed their machine guns. The battle was a perfect, horrific equilibrium of attrition. From the perspective of the men on the ground, the consequences of the ignored warning were absolute. They watched as American P-40 and P-51 fighters strafed and bombed the Japanese positions in the town, only to see those same positions erupt with renewed machine gun fire hours later. They knew, with a certainty that bordered on madness, that the bombs were falling in the wrong place. The true center of gravity, the key to the entire battle, was miles to the north, untouched and unseen by the planners who controlled the air assets. It was like watching a fire brigade trying to put out a burning building by spraying the roof, while someone was pouring gasoline through the basement window. The unfolding disaster was made even more poignant by the arrival of the Chinese forces. When they finally linked up with the Americans, they were thrown into the same grinder. Division after division of Chiang Kai-shek's troops were fed into the southern sector, fighting with incredible bravery, but suffering staggering losses for the same reason the Marauders had. The failure to sever the northern supply route was no longer just an American tragedy, it had become an Allied one, costing thousands of lives and squandering precious time. The stalemate was finally broken in early August, not by a brilliant tactical stroke, but by sheer, overwhelming mass. After nearly 3 months of siege, the newly arrived Allied forces, mostly Chinese divisions with American advisors, and a fresh U.S. infantry regiment, had built up such a superiority in numbers and artillery that they could simply crush the remaining Japanese defenders through brute force. They finally took the town, not with a scalpel, but by dropping a series of anvils on it. On August 3, 1944, Myitkyina was declared secure. The Ledo Road could continue. In the grand strategic picture, the objective was achieved. But the cost was appalling. The 48-hour mop-up had turned into a 78-day siege. The victory, when it came, was a hollow one for the handful of Marauder survivors. They were spectators at the end, too sick and broken to even participate in the final push. They had been the key, and their commanders had refused to turn them in the lock. They had solved the puzzle, and their answer had been thrown away. And as they were finally evacuated, their gaunt faces and haunted eyes were a silent testament to the tragic, avoidable losses that happen when the men who draw the maps refuse to listen to the men who die on them. For decades, the official story of Myitkyina was the one written by the victors, the one that appeared in the memoirs of generals. It was a story of a tough, costly, but ultimately necessary victory. The extreme casualties suffered by the Marauders were acknowledged, but framed as a heroic sacrifice, the unfortunate but unavoidable price of a vital strategic objective. The warnings from Colonel Hunter, the pilot's map, the controversy over the northern supply route, all of it was buried deep in the archives, footnotes in a history that had already been decided. The fog of war had been replaced by the fog of memory. Then, in the 1980s, the files began to open. Under the steady pressure of historians and veterans groups, the once classified after-action reports, the G2 intelligence summaries, and the daily unit logs from the CBI theater were declassified. And somewhere, deep in the U.S. National Archives, a historian pulled a dusty file. Inside was a series of frantic, handwritten messages from Colonel Hunter to Stilwell's headquarters. There was the pilot's crudely drawn map, showing the web of enemy supply lines. And next to it, the cold, dismissive replies from the rear echelon. But the most damning piece of evidence came not from an American file, but from the Japanese. Post-war interrogations of the Japanese commanders who had defended Myitkyina were made public. Most notably, the commander of the 114th Infantry Regiment, Colonel Fujiyasu Murayama, laid out his entire defensive strategy for his American captors. He spoke with a soldier's professional respect for his opponents, expressing his astonishment at the Americans' tactics. He confirmed, in meticulous detail, the existence of the northern supply route. He called it his lifeline. He stated that for the first 2 months of the siege, it remained almost completely operational, allowing him to bring in not just food and ammunition, but hundreds of fresh infantry replacements. He then delivered the final, devastating revelation. He told the interrogators that his greatest fear was not the frontal assaults, which he found bloody but predictable. His terror was that the Americans would discover his lifeline and cut it. If a small, mobile American force had flanked him and blocked that northern road, he admitted, his garrison would have run out of ammunition and food within 2 weeks. The siege would have collapsed in June, not August. The declassified file was a ghost, a voice from the past that finally, irrevocably, vindicated the men who had been ignored, disgraced, and broken. It proved that the Marauders hadn't been hysterical. They hadn't lost their nerve. They had been precisely, prophetically correct. Their investigation, conducted not in a clean office but in the mud and blood of the front line, had uncovered the absolute truth of the battlefield. The system hadn't just failed to listen, it had actively suppressed the one piece of intelligence that would have saved thousands of lives and ended the battle months earlier. The truth, after 40 years buried in a filing cabinet, had finally come out.